Okay, in this demo video, we're going to create a new vSphere cluster and enable vSphere configuration profiles during the new cluster workflow and see how we can add our host to the cluster and use a single cluster configuration document. So the first thing we'll do is create our new cluster, give it a name. We do have to activate the single image lifecycle management of vSphere Lifecycle Manager. Otherwise, we're unable to manage the configuration at a cluster level. So click the box to manage configuration at a cluster level, click Next, select the image for your cluster. In this example, we're using ESX8 Update 1. Click Next and complete the wizard. Okay, now that our cluster has been created, we need to add hosts to the cluster. So if we first navigate to our desired state configuration, there's going to be no configuration on this cluster right now. It's a brand new cluster. So the first thing we'll do is we'll populate the cluster with some of our hosts. So we'll add 3 hosts to the cluster. You'll see that a compliance check will automatically kick off when we add hosts to the cluster. Everything will be uncompliant at this point in time. We haven't defined the configuration for the cluster, so that's fine. Now in this example, we have pre-prepared ESX1 to be configured as we desire. So if we check some of its configuration, it's using some iSCSI storage. It's got some storage devices attached. It's got a couple of disks. We've got VM kernel adapters, and we're using just standard switches for this demo. And we've also configured NTP. So this host we're going to use as our reference. If we look at host 2, for example, it's got no NTP. It's got no VM kernel adapters other than the management network, so it's got less network configuration. It's got no data stores configured. And the same is true for ESX3. So let's use ESX1 as our reference. So back in vSphere configuration profiles, we're going to choose the option to extract from a reference host. I'm going to choose ESX1 as our reference. Click Next and click Download. So let's open that configuration document now. I'm going to use Notepad++ for this. So you can see our full cluster configuration. We can see the settings for ESX, networking, VMNICs, and storage, and then host-specific items that are unique to this particular host. It's got its IP address for VMK1, VMK0, VMK2, and so on. So this is going to form the basis for our full cluster configuration document. And really what we want to focus on is the host-specific section here. So we have a host-specific section for ESX1. We're going to need to build one for ESX2 and ESX3. So we're going to take it from the UUID bracket, and we'll just make a copy of that for ESX2 and ESX3, and we'll come back to these now in a moment. So the first thing I'm going to do is update their IP addresses. So I know that ESX2's IP address ends in 52, so I will update each of those, and its host name obviously is 02. And its iSCSI identifier as well. And we'll do this for host 3 also. Updating all the host-specific information for our ESX hosts. Now, the important aspect here now is the identifier is UUID, and it's BIOS UUID. And we can get that from the UI itself. If we check the compliance tab, let's go to host 2 first. We can see that the UI BIOS UUID is actually listed here. So let's take a copy of that, go back to our section for host 2, paste that in, and we'll do the same for host 3. Okay. So next we need to copy these into our larger cluster document, because these are just the host specific bits. So back to our full cluster document, we're going to need to add another entry here under host specific. So let's add in a comma and then paste in our entry for host 2, add in a comma and paste in the entry for host 3. And we don't have a comma at the end because it's the last item in this particular section. So what I like to do here, because we're using JSON, is just use a JSON validator. You can use an online or an offline validator just to make sure that all the syntax is correct. So we have valid syntax here, so we should be good to go. Now let's save that and go back to our cluster. So back on our cluster, go to the settings, and we're going to import our edited document now. So our document has been imported into the cluster. Another compliance check is going to be initiated. And we can see now that ESX1 is compliant. That was the host we used as our reference. We would expect that to be compliant. Host 2 and host 3 are now just misconfigured, missing the information that we have specified in our edited cluster configured document. So we can see things like a couple of port groups, a couple of VMK NICs, NTP configuration, those things that we expected that we knew were missing. So let's go ahead and remediate this cluster. So first, a pre-check will always be initiated just to make sure that there's nothing jumping out that may prevent the remediation from completing. The pre-check was completed, no issues were found. Click next, we can see the host level details, so what exactly is going to happen to each of the hosts for this remediation event. Now our hosts are already in maintenance mode, but if they weren't, they would be put into maintenance mode for these particular configuration updates. So lastly, just click remediate and let vSphere configuration profiles apply the cluster configuration document to the other hosts in the cluster, making them all uniform and compliant. So remediation event has completed. There were no errors, and all 3 hosts now are compliant with the desired configuration specification that we have imported into our cluster. If we want, we can inspect that configuration here under the settings tab. We can see information about network, for example. Let's take a look at VMK NICs and VMK 0. And we can see the information about the 3 hosts in our cluster and their configured IP addresses for this particular VMK NIC. And you can inspect all the other configuration here in the user interface. So that concludes this demo on creating a new cluster using vSphere configuration profiles.